Everyone, this is the sig-auth meeting for December 18th, 2024. Almost certainly our last meeting for the year. Um, I haven't done the math. I'm pretty sure that there's no more that would fit. Uh, but yeah, we got a pretty full agenda, so I guess let's get started. Let's see, Jordan, you're here. Is Tahir here or Michael? Is it just you from the list of people that owns the
It
first?
might just be me. That's fine. I can to hear just fine. Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Um, I can give a little context for this. This was a change that came in. I actually forget what motivated the change, if it was just sort of general tidiness or if there were particular audiences we were worried about, but it was in our ongoing quest to limit kubelets to only what we think they should be doing. Um,
Yeah.
we were saying kubelets are only allowed to get service account tokens for pods on them, service accounts actually on them. That's good. But there was nothing actually limiting the audiences they could request those tokens for. Uh, and some uses of service account tokens um, use them against audiences that are sort of outside the Kubernetes sphere domain and maybe higher value than Kube API server itself. But regardless, it's weird to be okay with kubelets asking for tokens for audiences that we don't see any reason the kubelet would be asking for that audience. It's not in the pod volume. It's not in a CSI driver volume. There's just no reason for it. So this pull request locked that down and said, here's all the audiences we think the kubelet is going to request it for. We're going to limit it to that. In one of the many places that people are having to make use of node credentials to do things because we don't have a good story for locking down service accounts to avoid escalating node permissions. We, GKE, had a node daemon that was getting tokens for pods running on the node. So it was inbound in terms of the service accounts it was asking for, but it was asking for it for an audience that was related to workload identity. And so that wasn't visible in an API facing way, wasn't known to this pull request restriction. And so that broke our thing. We have an escape hatch with the feature gate, so yay for escape hatches. But we need to figure out like what to do in this situation. Either short term, if we want to progress this, like finding a way to tell the policy enforcement, like here are other audiences we're actually okay with the kubelet getting, or long term, when we come up with a way to have actual service account authorization that is non-escalating for the node. Like we're in the background working through the design for that feature and saying like we kind of want to intersect service account permissions with what the node can already do. And so you kind of get back to the same place of saying, well, what audiences would be okay? Would we be okay with the node being able to mint tokens for? So whether it's short term, like an escape hatch or a config for this restriction, or long term with how does this inform like a node restricted, node intersecting service account authorization policy type thing. We kind of need a way to figure out how to allow this. So
Just a quick point, Jordan. So on the motivation, one of the motivations, at least on like mine and Anisha's part, was that as we were trying to expand the capability of Kubelet to use service account tokens to get for image build credentials,
mm-hmm.
that flow would be completely opaque to the REST API and could require audiences that are unknown to this plugin. And so we did not want to build that integration and then get stuck saying, "Oh, well, we can't restrict audiences now. We would break people's um, image pools now, and that's not okay." So instead, we said, "Well, we'll go ahead and say that nothing in tree uses this today, and so we'll go ahead and tell you no, and then we will be forced to build a mechanism to allow listed in some way, shape, or form
Yeah,
to actually
I'm
use it in the feature."
I'm happy with a lockdown to known uses for things we control with an escape hatch to flush people out of the woodwork and gather all the use cases for what do we need to make configurable, how dynamic does it need to be, how do we do that? That's totally fine. So
Let
I
me
don't
ask.
know that. we have a full agenda today, so I don't know that we're going to flush through like much discussion on this, but I wanted to bring up our use case, and it sounds like you also have a use case for sort of opaque audiences for other purposes. Um, yeah, if other people have similar types of things, I guess commenting on this issue. I don't know if this issue is where we want to coordinate, but yeah.
I think David, your hand was up first.
Yeah, so I was going to ask why a QAPI server flag instead of some sort of permissioning model. Was that I'm just not clear on why it seems like a permissioning model would age better.
I, I'm not attached to a flag. Yeah.
Okay.
When you say permissioning model, David, what are you thinking of? Just
You
like
know,
I know what flag
I
means.
think like it's as easy as a secondary RBAC check, like hey, or secondary authorization check. Hey, do you have permission to request this audience in particular? Similar to how we use for what was it? It was cluster trust bundles when you're modifying those as a check to see if you have some sort of rights to approve a signer, maybe.
So there's a
Okay.
set of audiences we know the kubelet should be able to do because it's in the API, and anything outside that set, like do a check instead of just saying hard no.
Yeah. So I think if your authorization check can be purely expressed with like service account name and the audience being requested without context for like the node, you're fine with just a simple authorization check. But if you want to tie it to the node and the service account and the audience, I think it might be a little hard to express what you want. Um,
Yeah, I don't object in principle to an authorization check. The devil would be in the details of like how to model it and if it has the dimensions we need. But I'm happy to take it in that direction if we think that makes sense.
okay. Yeah, I don't think I'm opinionated. Like I'm not in like I don't care if it's a flag or whatever. It just needs to work mostly. Tahir, you want to go?
Hearing from people who have the use cases to know how dynamic it needs to be might inform whether a flag would be a reasonable approach. Like how many values, how many audiences, how dynamic are they? Would they change over time? Flags might be a pain for that. When are they known relative to control plane creation, configuration,
So
stuff like that?
let me put them. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Let me put the maximum dynamicity case in your minds as sort of a provocative. Um, so we on GK we have a metadata server which is available at a fixed address from pods, and workloads in those pods can talk to the metadata server, retrieve credentials. In addition to the credentials that are mounted in, like Kubernetes credentials that are mounted into the pod file system. One thing, some use cases we've been talking about would be much more convenient if one of the metadata server endpoints offered the ability to get a kube API, like a Kubernetes jot with an arbitrary audience that you would pass as a get parameter. Um, like audiences are the domain of the workload. There's no reason to restrict it to a set number of audiences at boot time. If halfway through its running life it decides it needs to request a token for a new audience, why should it not have some mechanism for doing so? I think we can support this with our metadata server today by like we use our kubelet credential that we have stolen off the file system to make a service account token for the service account that the workload is running as, and then we make sure that that service account has permissions to generate tokens for itself with arbitrary audiences. Then the metadata server can kind of do all this behind the scenes.
But then you have an escalation path available to every node, and that's the point of trying to avoid this. Like it depends on how the allow
It
list
could,
from
yeah, it could only escalate. Hopefully, it could only escalate to service accounts that are actually running on the node.
yeah, that's already a hard limit based on the node restriction admission.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think if I understood Tahir's thing right, it would be that the restriction is in place as is defined today and you have it on, But what you would do is you would assign RBAC to that specific service account to create tokens for itself, which then wouldn't have audience restriction. And so what you would effectively end up doing at runtime is granting kubelets that have that workload scheduled the ability to get any audience for that workload if they were, willing to go through the hop of provisioning the credential that they're explicitly out to provision and then using that to provision more. I mean, it sounds fine. Like, that sounds super dynamic and you could do everything you want with it. And that would work today, even with the code as is.
Or let me maybe different, slightly provocative question that we don't need to like reach a conclusion on, but like, how valuable is restricting the audience? We can do it, but audiences are typically the domain of my workload decides it needs audience XYZ. We don't really care what, like, at least within GCP, the way we treat it
I mean,
is like
I
workload
think I
can
care a
request
lot.
whatever the heck it wants.
I think I care a lot about the strings in there because it depends on who you're trying to hand them to do what with.
Sure, but audience is cooperative, right? There's no point in restricting what audiences a workload can request because audiences are a cooperative security mechanism between the workload and the backend service that's receiving them.
I mean, we're not restricting what audiences the workload can request. We're restricting what nodes
At
can
runtime, you're restricting what it can request at runtime by limiting it to only things that it can pre-declare in a list in the pod manifest.
which has always been true, right? If you
It's more than
wanted
the pod.
dynamic,
It's more than the pod manifest though, too, right? It's like CSI and
Sure, yeah.
yeah, things that make sense within the context of the pod are allowed that are observable via the Kubernetes REST API, basically, right? But yeah, it's always been very static, right? So if you have like an agent that is trying to act on behalf of other things that is very dynamic, that was never actually really supported. It just happened to work, right?
So
Okay.
by adding this restriction, it would be helpful to enumerate the benefits of restricting this. I believe that there are benefits, but it would be helpful to list them out because it is sort of creating problems we have to solve to make some of these dynamic use cases still work. So if we're going to go do the work to solve that, it would be helpful to at least describe like concrete use cases. And I think maybe Mo or Micah, you might have some that here's why we don't want a kubelet to be able to get a token, even for a service account that's running on it, for a random audience over here that wasn't actually requested by the pod. Describing that would be helpful to sort of justify why did we lock it down and then have to find a way to unlock it in controlled ways.
Yeah.
We are 20 minutes into our meeting and
Yeah.
we have a long agenda. I'm happy to move on coordinated in this issue.
Sounds good. To hear you have the next item.
I don't think this needs too much discussion, but so it would be really helpful if audit logs told us which authenticator did stuff to the request. The linked issue / pull request did that, but then Tim or someone objected that this is abuse of audit log annotations and it really needs to be a field in the audit like proto, or I forget how we define it, if it's a ghost struct or which is fine, but then the work dropped and never got picked back up. Are we okay with exposing this information in audit logs by whatever means?
I think there's no objection to exposing it. I think, Jordan, last time we spoke about some of this, I think the rationale we had was if a request would basically always contain the information, or the vast majority of requests would contain the information, then it needs to be a first class field in the audit structure and not just shoved into audit implementations.
Yeah, I'm +1 on including it in the audit log for something that would effectively be present on every request, making it a field. and then figuring out what data we put in the field. I think right now authenticators don't have names. We could probably follow the pattern we did for authorizers and just assign names for the in-tree ones, and the configurable ones say like that you can have multiple of, which I think right now is just OIDC. Say you can put a name, like have a name field in the config to name the thing.
But well, authentication is beta right now, so for the V1 we could make it mandated if we wanted.
We can generate a name OIDC1, OIDC2, OIDC3 if you don't have names. If you give us names, we'll use the names you give us.
Yeah.
And I was saying probably for webhooks, it would make sense to just name the authenticator webhook, and then a webhook authenticator backend could put some sort of audit log annotation. Or we could introduce like two name fields, one first level name field and one freeform second level name field. I don't know.
It's weird to have it
I
spell
don't-
its own name, because I would totally name mine RBAC to mess with you.
Yeah.
But stepping back though, authentication webhooks can't assert audit annotations, right?
Yeah, we'd have to extend the interface somehow. Let them pass back a name that then gets put in either an audit field or
But do we need this level of flexibility? Can't the person configuring the webhook, don't they know its name or what they want to name it in the context of their configuration?
Yeah, but the webhook could in turn consist of a series of other pluggable things that people would want.
Okay, just include it in your
visibility.
user info response. Like that's where you shove in random metadata about how you authenticate it anyway.
I mean, I can definitely say that it wouldn't necessarily be associated with the user, so I could see hesitation.
Yeah.
But I might
Yeah.
say, how about we go for the amount that we agree on initially?
Sure, yeah.
Which I think is these things can have names. Having names is reasonable, and adding an actual field to the audit API is the best way to manage it.
Okay. I can send a PR to do that.
Are names
Do we need
going
a cap
to be
or
fully
not?
qualified in any way?
I would think we would name ours authentication.kubernetes.io/webhook/RBAC/ oh no, that's an authorizer. I don't know, but you get it.
Okay. I would probably say it would be a cap, right, to describe what we do. A very small cap, hopefully, but not too much.
There's no such thing as a very small cap. It's like 80 pages just in the template, but I can write a cap.
Unless people disagree, Jordan, David, do y'all disagree? Rita?
There's enough weirdness at the edge of like, what do you do for delegated authentication? How do you handle it? How do we translate existing stuff? I think the smallest cap you can manage is what I would want.
Or the argument over .kubernetes.io versus .case.io.
We're not supposed to use IO anymore, apparently.
Yeah, no more Indian Ocean domains.
We only got like 5 years before IANA takes it back and nukes it from orbit. I'm trying to think, Jordan. If I'm an aggregated API server and I get a request directly to my endpoint, and then I turn around and do a token review with Kube API server, what would my audit stream as the aggregated API server say was the authenticator? It would just say webhook?
I guess.
Okay. There might be some awkwardness there, but
it's also worth thinking about when the token request comes in to Kube API server and it calls the authentication chain and gets back an identity, like figuring out, making sure that something surfaces in the audit log for that to say, a token request came in, this identity came out, and this was the authenticator. Like if you're thinking in terms of a delegated or a aggregated API server, yeah, maybe it'll just say, I don't know, the webhook said it was Bob, but there should be a corresponding log in Cube API server that said, oh, there was a token request, and this particular OIDC authenticator said it was Bob.
When you said token request, do you mean token review request?
Token review, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, that was confusing. I was like, what, service account tokens?
Sorry.
Okay.
Into like slow motion 30 seconds ago, and sorry.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So you're saying if something causes token review to happen, that should, in that audit event, have like an audit annotation for the responding authenticator? Because the actual field in there would be for the color, right? Because we did something similar.
If the goal is to be able to trace like which authenticator made decisions, then the places that happens are just on the direct request, or for delegated authentication that went to some other server, like with the webhook. The authentication decision from a particular authenticator happened inside Cube API server, inside a token review. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's the same field in the audit. Maybe that's an appropriate place for an audit annotation. But yeah, I want something in the audit log to tell me when authenticators are making decisions.
Yeah, so I think this makes sense in regards to what we did with the service account JTI, right? So when you do a token request to get a service account JTI, that response includes an audit annotation for the minted tokens JTI. And then we didn't need to expand audit logs for this, but the actual user info claim from that service account token contains the JTI as well. So you can fully trace the issuance of the token as well as its usage. And I think you're asking for the same thing in this particular place.
I actually wanted to ask, shouldn't credential ID also be in like a first class field, not an annotation, if we're going to have it on like almost all?
Credential ID is in user info.
Okay.
Which makes it legible to authorization and admission automatically. If you just put it in audit, it would only be visible to audit stuff.
Oh, I'm confusing myself. GK specific detail. We copy it out to an audit annotation so that it is visible in our audit logs.
Fun. Okay, smaller, especially regarding delegated authentication. Okay. Anyone else have any comments on this? We're like halfway through the meeting and not halfway through the agenda. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Bryce, are you here?
Yeah. So I just generally wanted to float the idea of the RBAC plus related stuff, that conversations happened before KubeCon, and then there was a lot of auth focused talks that I went to at KubeCon, and it kind of popped into my head around, would it be a decent, how folks would feel about a more generic authorization policy API that allows for other policy engines, kind of similar to the Ingress API, maybe a combination of the Ingress API and validating admission policy API, to create like a API that policy engines can wrap around and make that composable. If I remember correctly from the sig-auth updates talk, it looked like that webhook authorizers are able to make some of these more fine-grained decisions, but there's not really any APIs to help define things in a more fine-grained way, which is kind of the inspiration for RBAC++. So I just kind of wanted to float this idea and see if there's any merit to it, if it was just one of those thoughts that popped up that I lent more energy to than I should have, or what have you. So just kind of wanted to get some general input on the idea, and then depending on that, take whatever steps from there.
David Riz.
But
I'll let you go.
For those that might not have clicked through ahead of time, do you want to spend 2 minutes describing what an authorization policy is and means? I have an idea of what I think you mean in my head, but I'm actually not sure.
I mean, in my head, this would be, and maybe some of the examples I have aren't great in here, just because I'm not familiar with Rego or Cedar's syntax. But my thinking is the idea here is you can use something like CL or Rego or some other language that you can use to take the properties that are passed to like a webhook and evaluate them. So Rego has all this stuff that you can do these different return values and stuff like that. But if you take in something like a deployment and you can check to make sure that if it has these labels or whatever, that it's allowed to be done or something like that, depending on who the user is or any of that kind of stuff. So you could pass in user information and resource that they're trying to do this operation on and go from there. I Again, this isn't something that I've had a ton of time to really like think through. As I was sitting around in between talks at KubeCon, I kind of was iterating on this, and then after KubeCon, didn't really have time to dig further. So, if you've got any suggestions for what this
Just trying to
could,
see if I understand maybe. So if I'm looking at this, I think that the idea is that there is some sort of shared way to describe common to all policies, a way to describe this applies to requests that are in this group or this version with these verbs and these resources. And maybe it also has a shared concept of binding for users. I'm not entirely clear on that. But then it has a more or less open section where you can describe a policy that will be evaluated in that case, and you're passing it off somewhere. You said webhook, maybe a webhook, maybe not, to be evaluated. Is that roughly the idea? So that the value is in the common selection of applies to these things, applies to these users.
yeah. So generally, these things apply to these resources for this thing, or it can be. You can also add users or however, and then the policy engine or whatever. So something like Open Policy Agent or Kyverno or Cedar or whatever has their own language and syntax where this more open field is that a user can define based on that syntax, and then all of the information necessary for that to check that policy whenever a request comes in that meets those criteria. That information is provided to wherever that policy decision point is that then evaluates that against the policy defined in the more open-ended piece.
Okay, that helps me at least understand what's intended here. Thank you.
I think I saw Jordan's hand was up first.
Tahir was in and out. I don't know if you feel free to jump if you had thought.
Oh, I was sure. So I think if we look at validating admission policy and we imagine an extension to validating admission policy where the calling user is also one of the things available to the cell expression, then we have an Uber policy that subsumes RBAC and validating admission policy. Oh, it is? Okay. User is already available. Then I think we've that's the final evolution of all policy ever, right? Like,
well, admission doesn't run on read requests.
okay, yeah. But yeah, I can imagine conditional RBAC where you attach a cell condition or all kinds of various points in between.
My thinking with a more open-ended like policy expression layer is that people can pick and choose which one they want to use, and maybe that's too much freedom, and there's pros and cons I think to either one, but with a pretty large ecosystem it seems around different authorizers with different ways of writing policy and stuff, it seemed potentially reasonable to have that be more open-ended than just sell expressions. But
So some of the things I was thinking, you mentioned ingress coming as an example, and I would say the APIs where we had sort of an API as spec with implementation to be left as an exercise for the deployer have not. I don't know that I would say they've worked out super well. Like ingress and network policy, and are the two in-tree ones I know of. Gateway is out of tree. And I think all three have struggled to figure out how to define the API in a way. So here, policies with expressions that are just sort of opaque blobs, I guess. The API server is not going to be able to validate those for like arbitrary policy engines. And so you kind of just have to allow CRUD, create, update, whatever, of anything opaque. And that moves any problems with those expressions to like whatever is interpreting those. So you don't get good feedback, or it's difficult to get good feedback if those are invalid in some way. And then the question is like, all right, you persisted in an invalid expression. What happens at the edge? Like, does that just fail closed or fail open? There's kind of crummy outcomes for each of those options. So it's and the idea that sort of an opaque blob of an expression is going to be sufficient for all cases. Even with the cell stuff and validating emission, we saw benefits to sort of breaking out like variables that could get evaluated once and reused, and then match conditions that are maybe cheaper to check and sort of eliminate conditions early. And so I'm a little skeptical that we'd be happy with the shape of an API that was sort of minimum viable. I don't know, it's just an opaque blob. It goes to the back end and errors get handled there async. That was one thought. The second was just evolution of this. And again, like ingress and gateway have really struggled to evolve the API. Like every new thing you add to the API, you now have, because the backing implementations are at all different levels with all different capabilities, maybe they will never update to be aware of the new stuff in the API. It's just very difficult for someone writing to the API to be confident that what they're like the policy they're writing is actually going to get picked up by something and is actually going to enforce something and is actually going to do what they want.
Yeah.
Rita, I think you're next. Go. Did you not want to go, Rita? I can go if you didn't.
Sorry, clicked on the wrong button.
Oh,
Um,
oh, sorry. Go ahead. If you need to talk, go ahead.
yeah. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong button. But anyway, thanks for the proposal. I was just kind of curious what you envisioned for offloading that request to a policy engine, as these expressions would require some mechanism to communicate with the policy engine, right? And much like Cell is in Kubernetes core, are you thinking that all these would need to be added to core, or would there be a mechanism to offload that, redirect that?
My original thinking, and maybe to Jordan's point, it's not a great API to model after, was the way that the ingress stuff is set up, where you've got like an ingress controller that it reads the ingress class and configures based off of that. But beyond that, I hadn't really thought too much beyond the information that's provided is what's already given to webhook authorizers today. And all of those opaque blobs of policies would be written such that they take those in and make decisions based off of that. But again, like I said, this was a initial thought, and I appreciate all of this feedback and stuff like that. So yeah, hopefully that roughly answers your question with as much as I've thought about it. But
yeah, thanks.
Okay, I'll go. So just my thought was, so like Anish and I, when we did the RBAC plus plus like POC stuff, right? Like the rationale for using cell is sort of like multifaceted, right? Like one is that, we already have to maintain in-tree cell support, so we've already taken that hit. Um, Cell supports the cost stuff and the pretty strong type checking, so you can have a reasonable chance of like at, um, creation time, knowing that you actually have a valid policy. Um, yeah, I don't see how something like the auth Z layer can offload its engine in the same way that Ingress can, because it's like in line to the main request path of the API server. And so you basically are stuck with like webhooks. And then like what happens if you have an engine that just isn't configured on that cluster, right? Like the other thing I was going to say is like I think the reason RBAC is so widely used in our ecosystem is because it's completely portable, right? Like you get the same meaning for RBAC no matter where you go, right? And so um I think if we're gonna have stuff in tree, right, like we should try to aim for portability. And like yeah, the webhooks aren't portable across um ecosystems, but they're also meant for like much more advanced use cases anyway. Um,
Yeah, as a user of Gateway, it's like you don't read the Kubernetes documentation. You go to your provider, you read them. Here's the gateway objects, all the stuff you create to get a GKE load balancer or GCP load balancer, and you just do that. It seems like it's very different for each platform.
right. David, you want to go, and then we probably should time box this.
Yeah. So I'll say that the amount of flexibility here does, like Jordan said, seems to stick out maybe a little bit more than we need. But I think the exploration is really useful. If you go back and find the recording that we had with Mo when he first presented RBAC plus plus to this group, there were several comments that came back as, think about trying to explore it this way and see if we get something that's actually a little easier for us to understand and manage. If you do have energy for this space, I think working to try to create that narrower, more strictly defined API where behavior is well known, but that combines sort of the level of simplicity that Mo was going for with maybe the power that Micah has tried to produce. Having a single API to represent, you can look at these things and you can modify these fields seems really useful for forwarding several of our goals, right? To avoid over granting, for instance. And so I don't want you to go from this and say like, hey, I don't want to look at this anymore at all. They said no, but instead look at it and say, what can I do that like builds on what the feedback the other people have gotten as well, um, to eventually get us to a point where we have a good API for representing it. Because I would love to see sometime in 2025, an API that can actually incorporate these things.
Cool. Thanks for the feedback, everyone. I will definitely go back and think more on it. I appreciate all the feedback, and thank you for your time.
So, Rita, you wrote a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, so this one was just circle back on this particular cap. If you could open, I don't know, are you sharing your screen? Yes, you are.
Yes.
Where?
Okay. So the comment that I linked to was basically Patrick confirming that sounds like if sounds like we could basically meet the requirement by ensuring that special resource claim templates and resource claims are created within a sorry with the admin access field are created in an admin type of namespace, and therefore we could actually in the REST storage layer we could actually validate the resource claim template. Resource claim resources are created in an admin namespace with an maybe like DRA admin type of note label, and that should be sufficient. I know, David, you had a bunch of concerns about all the options that were listed. In particular, if we were to create a VAP to validate in-tree resources, specifically this particular one because of the per node authorization. So I think this is why I wanted to confirm with Patrick that what is this actual requirement? And it sounds like using a namespace label is sufficient. Any other concerns based on this new
I
information?
figured I would go ahead and elaborate on why I was concerned about the validating emission policy and how it would intersect with some sort of a conformance requirement. And my concern there was that if we wanted a degree of subdivision or requiring a degree of subdivision that we could only enforce with this validating emission policy, then I didn't see a way for us to actually guarantee that it would always have been honored. Like, who could have gotten in and updated this value before we enforced? And if we decide like, hey, it doesn't need to be a conformance thing, like it's a good security practice, then that seems okay. But I didn't want to end up in a spot where we said it's always behaves in this way, and we were actually unable to enforce it. So if we sidestep that entirely, it's completely fine.
I admit I haven't followed this one super closely. Is the I don't know what the consequences of having control over this Boolean field are. Is
Yeah,
it the kind of thing that if you don't control it?
And maybe Rita can then tell me
Based
what
on
I
what
said.
Patrick is saying, I think the goal is to allow certain workload to do admin things on the device, like say metrics, get metrics from the device. And we don't want any normal user to be able to do acts like that, right? So therefore, these resource claims are actually admin resources, and therefore they shouldn't be consumable by any other non-admin workloads, right? So because of that, the logic is the only way that you can do this today is by isolating these resources within a namespace that only admins have access to. Right? And
the only mechanism to do that currently would be after the cluster gets started, you create a webhook or a validating emission policy to enforce that. So there's this gap from
that's right.
cluster creation.
That's right.
And I can see that as long as it remains like, hey, best practice, you should do this, then I don't really have any concern, right?
Yeah, so the thought process I had there was that if you consider what we did with PSA, we sort of codified that labeling namespaces is a privileged operation and you shouldn't allow that willy-nilly because we decided to enforce policy based off of that being set. So my rationale there was that I think we could probably do better than just saying best practice here, and we could say that built into API server, right, there is some understanding of some specific labels or label prefixes or whatever that map to the admin style operations being allowed in a particular namespace. I don't fully know the granularity of like what needs to be expressed in those labels because I haven't followed the kept too closely. But that was kind of my thought process is that like when you create one of these resource claim or resource claim templates within the namespace, if you set that Boolean field to true, then we would in the rest storage layer just check the labels on the associated namespace that was in to make sure that was okay. And if not, we would just fail it at create or update time.
What users do we include resource claim permissions in the default namespaced roles like edit, admin?
I don't know if what they did with DRA, but I would my understanding so far is that these are developer facing resources.
I thought so as well. I'm thinking about like what happens in upgrade as like someone upgrades to something that has this feature available. Cluster admin didn't read the release notes. Do normal users who are using our edit and admin roles now have the ability to drive creation of these things? And unless the cluster admin takes action proactively, will be able to like toggle on this Boolean admin device access bit.
So the Boolean that is the Boolean that we're talking about is behind an alpha feature gate.
Sure, but eventually it won't be.
Right.
Like on upgrade to the version that no longer gates this thing when you can persist data into the field is like if an admin does nothing, what are they exposed to is how I would ask the question. I don't know enough about what this Boolean does to know.
So like if the admin did nothing and then we and tree also did nothing to prevent the Boolean being set?
Yeah, like I actually can't find the resource claim resource in like user facing roles. So I don't even know that we've given this permission by default to end users. If that's the case, maybe it's fine. Like the admin has to grant this out to them. You need to protect it, lock it down, whatever. Like maybe that's fine. If we are including those permissions in default roles automatically, then I think more of the burden is on us to like keep what they get access to via those permissions from being egregious.
Yeah, but wouldn't we want the latter, Jordan? Wouldn't we want to provide you with good starting points, including the protections, instead of saying, hey, here's an RBAC role in role binding you could create, but don't, because if you do, then you also give them admin level access to your devices, which you didn't intend. Also make a VAP. It's just like, what?
If they are having to take action to grant the API permissions to create these things in the first place, then saying along with granting it with this RBAC role, like you should probably also lock it down. Here's a reasonable way to lock it down. The example could have all three of those things. Like here's how you include the RBAC permissions, and here's how you set up the validating emission policy. Like if they're having to take positive action to give their users access to this in the first place, then including locking it down in a way that makes sense for them maybe is reasonable. If we're granting access by default on some upgrade, then I think it's less reasonable to say, just so you know, you should lock down before you upgrade, or we're going to let users you thought were namespaced like blow up your cluster. I will take those comments to the pull request. We don't have to iterate here.
Well, so this is I'm gonna create a new cut for this since this was added as a alpha flag as part of the DRA cap, but I think folks thought it would be a good idea to have a separate cap for this particular field. But Jordan, to your point, like today, a dev who has access to create CRUD operations for resource template and resource claim could just add this admin field, right? Because we don't have field level granularity here. So this is why the CAP would have to explain what kind of validation we need to add in core in tree to validate only admins can add this field, even though normal users can create this resource. Does that make sense?
Whether it's a separate
Because
cap
this
or
is
not, I
field
don't
level.
have an opinion. Like we've put multiple gates in a single cap. That's fine. If it's more efficient, we can do that. Describing clearly how do users get access to it, what happens by default, and what do they get access to by default, and
right
what gets locked down by default. I think that makes a lot of sense. I need to
right.
get on the details of it, so I'm happy to do that offline.
Okay. All right.
Okay, maybe we can try to get through at least one more. Rita, audit ID something size.
I think this came up in audit, sorry, not audit, in sig-auth triage meeting. This was just an issue that someone actually reported to SRC, I think, and then we advised that please open a public issue. That idea is that, let me look at the issue. Basically, there's concerns of inject malicious string because audit ID currently doesn't have any validations for special characters. So do we need a cap for this? What's a good next step here?
I would expect to put some sanity check limits around it. It shows up in headers, I think. So size limits like 128 characters or 256 characters or something ish like that, that encompasses every known generator we know of, and limits to like printable characters or ASCII dash underscore numeric characters, something like that. Probably with an escape hatch to say, like, if this sanity check breaks you, like, toggle off the sanity check and come talk to us, because we'll lock this down probably in a few releases. I don't think we need a cap for this. I think this isn't.
Okay, but you're thinking maybe a feature flag?
I think this falls under the category of something we consider a bug fix, and we're very confident will not break anybody, but just in case something crazy is out in the world, there's an escape hatch. And we
Okay,
leave it on by default, but with an escape hatch for a few releases. And if nobody comes and complains to us, then we're like, yep, locked to.
on by default, but we don't do on by default for new feature flags, do we?
Depends if
This one looks
It,
like a bug.
it's more of an escape hatch for a bug fix we are 99% confident in, but not 100% confident in. I'll link. Tim, I thought, did a pretty good job of sort of describing where we use gates. When we're doing them as features, we do the off by default,
Okay,
on by default, locked to default progression. But when we're doing them as escape hatches for effectively bug fixes, starting them on by default is fine.
okay, all right.
related to this, so do we have a use case today where an arbitrary client can set audit ID? Like, I know we want aggregated API servers and all that fanciness to work, and request header proxies, and those are all fine. Those are highly privileged. What's like the other, like, when do we expect a client to do this? That's not one of those.
I don't remember the context on when this was added. I think David Ashpole maybe added it as part of like tracing across processes, servers. I was always pretty weirded out by the idea of giving the client control over this ID. I don't know if anything is actively making use of that or not.
Yeah,
I
like
think
the way I would
some
see it is, I don't
limitations
care what
are-
characters are in there. Just don't let anyone but like a request header proxy set it. And sorry, David, I think I interrupted you.
I was gonna say I know it's used in aggregated API servers and
Is it? Okay.
works well because what happens is you get the same context all the way through.
Yeah.
Idea of the
But
header
that one's
match.
okay though, David, right? We wouldn't break that one because the Kube API server acts as a request header
I'm not
proxy.
accusing you of breaking it. You asked where it was used. I was confirming that's where it's used.
Oh, okay.
Does it protect use of that header?
No,
Like if the user sets that
if the
header.
user sets it as like the QAPI server, it's honored.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the part I don't understand is like it's totally fine to let a super privileged proxy in front of you tell you the audit ID. That's totally fine. But rando that can talk to you on the network, even if they're literally unauthenticated, they can just tell you, like, what?
I think it's worth understanding better if that's used, how it's used, if there's ways we could control that, but I would do that independent of the sort of size and care set limits. The size and care set limits are, I would be fine to put in place like right now. the propagation we need to understand that better before we try to change anything about that.
Do you have any recommendations on what we should do? Because I don't know how to ask people about their audit ID usage because I don't know where to look.
Understanding how we use it, at least within the project, for the servers we know about, aggregated servers, proxy servers. If there's a way to limit it to aggregated or proxy paths, if that makes sense, maybe that would be a starting point. I just don't even know what the impact of that would be, so I don't have a hard time figuring out what we could do there.
Okay. Rita, anything else? I think we're out of time, so I will copy everything else on the agenda to the next meetings.
One random question: when should we gear up for things that missed 132, but we want to go into 133? Now?
Now you
Okay.
are welcome to go make PRs that say this, like pod certificate. You can just go update the KEP to say now the next milestone is 133, and we will just merge it and put it in the release, and we will try again.
I think a lot of people are probably out after this week, but pick up reviews like first of the year, first of whenever people are back. Yeah,
sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks everyone. We will see y'all next year.
Good to see y'all. Bye.
Yeah.
Happy holidays. Bye.